Here we go. All right, so the point of what I want to talk about today is to increase the understanding of the human experience of suicide and perspectives of the bereaved and the experience of the person who takes their life. To have a bit of a look at what we do know about suicide and how it is presented in our society and understood by our society. And I'm meaning Western society here in the main. I really have not sure how it's viewed in other Eastern societies or other societies. I can only really speak to how it's viewed in Western society. And some of my perceptions around why suicide is perceived as a choice, a sin or a weakness. Then going on to what is the suicide loss survivor experience and what support is available to them. And then looking at survivors sharing of after-death communication and experiences in the context of suicide and what we learn about it from those. And then finally, what are the spiritual perspectives on suicide that best help us understand this experience? And obviously that's very personal to me, but it's based on what I have learnt through all my experiences. So essentially my story is where I need to go from here. I lost my father to suicide in 1997 when I was in my early 30s, and he had a long history of depression. And of course, as a child growing up in the 1970s, it was just, oh, he's a difficult man. And that's really how mental illness has been viewed for a very long time. Not much understanding around diseases such as depression. But then he developed Parkinson's disease in his later life. And that's obviously, for those who don't know, it's a progressive neurodegenerative disease. And he just got to the point where I think his depression just overwhelmed him and he took his life. I was, I had young children at that point. I was working pretty much full time, and I just kind of pushed it all down, pushed it aside. There was no one to talk to about suicide back in those days. It really was, he actually took an overdose, so it was passed off as a heart attack by my family. So I was the only one that actually, when my father died, I actually did tell people. I said, well, it actually wasn't it was a heart attack induced by an intentional overdose. I was the only person in my family who actually said this is actually what happened. I'm a nurse, profession, so I'm a pretty, I just am a tell it how it is person, I'm afraid. But that didn't sit very well with my family. So then, fast forward essentially to mid-2015, my son started showing signs of depression, and he was 15 at the time, and it was a very difficult time. He had one attempt on his life in 2017, which got interrupted by the police, and he got taken to an emergency department, which traumatised him. He did try and engage with the health profession, but look, to be honest, and as the nurse of 35 plus years, I have to say that I feel that, mental health care is, compared to physical health care, is incredibly poorly managed, incredibly poorly funded. He lost, basically, he engaged for a little while, but did disengage fairly rapidly due to his illness, but also due to some pretty difficult experiences he had with the profession, with the mental health profession. So he actually took his life at the age of 19 in 2019. Of course, it was devastating. I had no belief in the afterlife at that point, but in the year afterward, I had a lot of spiritually transformative experiences that made me really question the larger purpose of life, why we are here, and why profound life-changing loss is the path of some people. It made me think, is this just all by accident? What's the role of free will? And is there any overall purpose that sheds any meaning on the suffering related to this loss? It's, yeah. So, you know, what do we know about suicide? Look, we know in Australia it's the leading cause of death of people under 45 years, and that comes from the Australian government and the National Health and Welfare Institute that puts out those figures. And we know in the world that someone dies by suicide every 40 seconds, and that comes from the World Health Organization. So, you know, it's huge, and it's only getting bigger with the, you know, everything that we're dealing with in the world today. You know, we don't know a lot about the mechanism that leads to suicide, but, you know, there is a tunnel thinking that precedes the act. It's estimated that many have a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness. Up to 70 or 80% of people that take their life do, but some don't. And, you know, it is up to 20 to 30% that don't. Some people have ongoing suicide ideation. Some don't. Sometimes suicide's a well-planned act, and sometimes it's impulsive. You know, I read a figure that was put out by the American Survivors Association that estimated that single vehicle accidents, motor vehicle accidents that are fatalities, up to 15% could be suicides. We just really have no idea of the accurate figure. Some scientists are now beginning to understand that there are some genetic links in some cases. And we can do brain scans and see now where, you know, people with depression that have, it just shows up in areas of the brain. So we are getting somewhere towards being able to actually measure and see where the effects are on the brain. I've wanted to mention the work of Dr. Richard A. Heckler, and I'm not sure if people know about that. He wrote a book called Waking Up Alive, and it actually studied people who'd survived suicide attempts. He talks a lot about the suicide trance, and he believes, you know, what is the suicide trance? It's a state of the mind and the body that receives only the kind of input that reinforces the pain and corroborates the person's conviction that the only way out is through death. He argues that everyone who attempts suicide enters the suicide trance. And common characteristics of the suicide trance are that the person can seem very logical and organised and rational in their thinking, but they're also, in some instances, and often as a state of resignation. Often one of the signs is a state of withdrawal from life and withdrawal from people, which precedes the downhill spiral. And certainly that was my experience in both my father and my son. So how is suicide viewed by society? And look, I'm afraid, you know, there is still an awful lot of stigma. You know, is it a choice? Is it a weakness? And, you know, I kind of got that a lot after my son died. I can tell you that the grief associated with suicide loss is extremely traumatic and complicated. Along with murder and manslaughter, it's considered one of the hardest griefs to process and live with, because the perpetrator is also the victim, and that adds to the complexity of the grief. It's been compared to a catastrophic in terms of the stress on the body. It's been compared to the concentration camp survivor experience. I just want to highlight the difference between suicide and voluntary assisted dying, and the distinction there. Anecdotal experience suggests that people with life-limiting illnesses that are causing unrelieved suffering often only take their lives when and suicide when the means to undertake voluntary euthanasia is not available or it's illegal. So yes, people who do have terminal illnesses take their life, but I would suggest that if they had other means available, that it would be, and it's the mechanism is not the same. And when people think that suicide is a choice, they're really ignoring the existential emotional pain and the suffering of mental illness or of a life-limiting physical illness. We don't ever say to a person with a terminal cancer that they should try harder. And as a society, we often see the broken limb and feel sympathy and compassion, but we don't feel the same level of compassion for that which we cannot see. And I just wanted to highlight the quote there that I found very comforting, and I know a lot of suicide loss survivors find very comforting, and it's from Father Ron Rollheiser, who's in the United States. Suicide is an illness, not a sin. Nobody just calmly decides to end their life and burden his or her loved ones with that death any more than anyone calmly decides to die of cancer and cause pain. The victim of suicide, in all but rare cases, is a trapped person, caught up in a fiery, private chaos that has its roots both in his or her emotions and his or her biochemistry. Suicide is a desperate attempt to end enduring pain, akin to one throwing oneself through a window because one's clothing is on fire. And I think that's a very powerful way of viewing it. And going on with that topic of why suicide is considered a sin, a choice or weakness, I think there are a lot of the cultural and religious values of Western society, and we've been brought up with the sacredness and sanctity of life, that you shouldn't take your life, just as you shouldn't take the life of an unborn fetus, and the religious perspectives of sin and divine punishment. Again, unfortunately, there is a lot of ignorance still around the existential agony of mental illness and the stigma surrounding that. Our lack of scientific understanding of the brain and how it can essentially malfunction. Suicide loss survivors do refer a lot to the feeling that they believe that their loved one's brain was hijacked. And in fact, that is actually how it feels. The inability to accept that as humans, we just don't have the control we think we do. We just don't. Our desire to believe that the suicide could have been prevented. As humans, we're really big on creating narratives to help us understand our lives and the things that happen to us, those around us and those that we love and care about. We have rituals, beliefs and structures to help us survive on a daily basis. The problem is for the lost survivor that these narratives can be really simple and narrow. There's such a myriad of emotions related to close suicide loss that are very deep and real. Lost survivors torture themselves with guilt, self-blame. There's anger and constant rumination. They couldn't protect their loved one from themselves, and they relive the last days of their person's lives. And mothers and parents feel particularly that they've failed their child. We want to redo, and it's a very torturous time to survive. So what is the suicide loss survivor experience, and what support is? So most suicide loss survivors do suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly those that find their loved one or witness a suicide. It's extremely difficult. Survivors are 10 times more likely to take their life in the first year after suicide loss. It is a very isolating, lonely experience. I do liken it a little bit to from what I have read, to the experience of near-death experiences, in the sense that we feel out of sync with the rest of the world. The traumatic complicated grief, it's now actually in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, and that's helpful in the sense that it means that people can access ongoing counselling and psychological support, etc., and access to trained physicians and practitioners, because this is something that takes years to deal with. It's not something that we get through in a few months. Unfortunately, there are very few trained clinicians who specialise in traumatic loss and suicide loss, and there's also a very high rate of burnout as well. I have to say that early grief after suicide loss is considered the first 2 years. The first 3 to 4 years, and I'm just hitting the 4-year mark, are incredibly difficult. And it takes 5 to 6 years on average for the loss to start to be processed and integrated in the person's life. And they're just averages. In terms of what support is available, and to be honest, I think the most beneficial support for many survivors is peer support. Like anything else, as it is for the near-death experiences, you have got to have been through this to understand it, essentially. I found both the Alliance of Hope and Helping Parents Heal within the first year of losing my son. And I have to say, between them, they saved my life. Alliance of Hope is an American-based organisation that's been going since 2008, and it has over 20,000 registered members and probably 10 times as many who just read. I work as volunteer as a moderator on that forum, and it's frightening. In March we had more people join. This month we've had more people join than we do in the previous 6 months. It's frightening. Helping Parents Heal is another American-based organisation with over 20,000 members that was co-founded by Elizabeth Bousson, who's lost her son in 2010. And there is affiliate groups of Helping Parents Heal all over the world. I've been co-facilitating my group for nearly 3 years now. We have over 150 members. We host Zoom groups every month focusing on Australia and New Zealand, but we get people also from other time zones. And we generally have about 10 parents every month. And unlike other groups, we take people straight away. Other support groups won't take new survivors because they consider it too triggering for people who are working through their grief, but we will just take anyone and support them from day one. And we, in our group, focus on continuing bonds and spirituality. And just as it is for near-death experiences, having these, it's so important to have those forums where we can share after-death communications and experiences. There's still a no-no in many of the government-funded support groups. They won't allow discussion of spirituality in the afterlife. Certainly that's really difficult for people. People on both Alliance of Hope and in Helping Parents Heal, they're full of people sharing their personal experiences of their very own specific signs that their loved ones send them and of visitation streams. Mediums have played an incredibly important role in providing evidence that's external to our own experience, and it's very validating. Mediums have brought forward very valuable information about what the afterlife is for the person who's taken their own life. They let us know. I really believe that, and it's been my experience, especially after losing my son, that people who have lost someone to suicide, that person is very motivated to let us know that they're okay and thriving, that they're not punished and they're not in hell. And they don't, because they know that we're going through our own type of hell. So I just believe that they try very hard to reassure us and comfort us. And the communications that both I and very many others who've posted on these forums that they've had via meetings are very consistent with the spiritual perspectives that I'm going to discuss next. And these are not people who've read these perspectives beforehand. So I find that very interesting. I'm sure that most of you here have heard of soul contracts and the concept. of course, soul contracts, and the idea that we create our own blueprint of what virtues we wish to work on to develop in our souls before we incarnate into this life. And that we plan with some of the significant milestones of our lives with the intent of developing our own souls and the souls of those we wish to incarnate with. The perspectives I will share provide those who've lost someone to suicide with hope and an expanded perspective. First person I want to talk about, and many of you would have heard of him, is Dr. Mark Pitstick. He's collaborated extensively with people such as Dr. Gary Schwartz. He's a co-director of the Soul Phone Project. He has his website, soulproof.com, and he's an author of many books. The article on his website, When a Loved One Passes On by Suicide, is really resonated with me. Mark tells the story of a mother who shared that her 5-year-old son told her several times, "I'm going to die when I'm 30. He did, in fact, develop schizophrenia and died at the age of 30 when he took his life after many years of mental illness. I've heard of that a lot. My son always told me he would never get married. He would never talk about what he wanted to do when he grew up. There were those sort of little indicators. He said, I never want to grow up, Mum. So Mark outlines 5 reasons why someone may pass by suicide. Firstly, there's a real self-desire to develop more love and compassion. So that soul volunteered to experience immense despair. And one possible outcome is that someone will live a long life and achieve their goals and maintain balance. And another is that they're willing to attempt to undertake great growth with a difficult mind, and that those around the person agree to support that person, knowing that suicide could be the outcome. The possibility of suicide is considered worthwhile for the potential growth in love, compassion, evolution, and service to others. So that's a powerful perspective. B, the person might have fulfilled a necessary role for another. And that's sort of the concept of soul growth through opposite experience. Perhaps one of the souls that we regularly incarnate with chose suicide in a number of previous incarnations, and Mark refers to her as Ruth. Ruth needed to experience what it was like to lose a soulmate to suicide because she'd chosen it in previous incarnations. So perhaps Ruth's child or another close family member, in the attempt to help Ruth's soul growth by taking their life so that Ruth could experience the pain, the suffering, and the guilt of suicide loss. Thirdly, see that suicide may have been a timely way to return home. The soul who returns home via suicide to help Ruth may have benefited because a long earthly life wasn't needed. He may have covered bases A and D at the same time. What is viewed as a senseless tragedy from a human's perspective may have been viewed as a triple win for soul growth. D, physical death by suicide may have been a way to help others and the world. And so many young people are passing these days by suicide. Could it be that their souls love so much that they are willing to suffer for others or for the greater good? Development of treatments and skilled holistic health practitioners may result. Is it possible that suicide will help motivate healthcare professionals to address core causes of mental symptoms and help many more people? And finally, D, that death by suicide provides a relief valve. And it makes sense that escape routes or exit points in life are planned for very difficult experiences during earthly incarnation. That suicide is a way for the soul to say, you're not going to achieve what you set out to do in this life, or I just can't take it anymore because it's just too difficult and painful. So they're very interesting ways of looking at it, and certainly offer an alternative perspective. And just finally, I'd like to talk about Robert Schwartz. And most of you would have heard of Robert, and obviously he's the author of the book, Your Soul's Plan, Discovering the Real Meaning of Life You Planned Before You Were Born. And the suicide chapter, Your Soul's Gift, I'm not sure if many of you have read it, but it is deeply enlightening. So he shares in that book, the story, that chapter, the story of Cameron and Carolyn. So Carolyn's only son, Cameron, suicided shortly after graduating from high school. And Carolyn and Rob Schwartz had a channeling session with a medium in which they spoke with Joshua Jesus. And from that channeling, it was found that in Cameron's case, suicide was planned as a high probability because he took so much on in this lifetime that made suicide likely. Cameron described via the medium that because of his chronic depression, he couldn't feel his capacity to love himself or his family. In body, Cameron was unable to feel and therefore unable to experience the great love that he had for his family. I had my first medium experience before I read this chapter about a year after I lost my son. And the words that Cameron said to Carolyn were essentially the same words, that this medium, my son relayed via a medium. The medium had obviously never met me. She was very talented. She obviously had no idea I'd lost a son. She had no idea I had lost a son to suicide. And the words were almost, what I'm going to read now, are essentially the words this medium conveyed to me from my son. I am deeply sorry for the pain and grief I caused you and the ones I left behind. It was never my intention to hurt you. I did not see a way out at the time of my suicide, and I was desperate and I wanted a quick fix. Rob describes that via the channeling of Joshua by the medium, that suicide was a turning point for Cameron's soul because he realised the full extent of his love that he couldn't feel in life. And this was a great breakthrough for his soul growth. He was greeted by his guides and he was escorted home. For his mother, who was racked with guilt and self-blame for not preventing her son's suicide and who could not remember her pre-birth agreement with Cameron, Joshua shared every suicide is preventable by outside forces will be prevented. If the suicidal mind has the slightest openness to changing their mind, there will be an intervention. It could be a small distraction like a bird flying overhead, or it could be an earth angel that directly intercedes in the event, but there will be an intervention. And just finally, the most healing words that I feel that I've ever heard spoken, and these are Rob's words that were channeled via, well, not Rob's words, Joshua's words that were channeled by the medium. If you have lost a loved one to suicide, know this. There was literally nothing you could have done to save them. Therein rests your healing. Therein rests your peace. Yeah, it's very powerful, and I hope that I have those insights have been beneficial for you. And I would like to turn it back to Wendy. Thank you so much for listening.